Throughout American history, the scope of presidential power has been tested, challenged, and defined through both landmark court cases and legislative action. Three pivotal moments illustrate these tensions. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Cumber v. Sawyer, 1952, the Supreme Court struck down President Truman's attempt to seize steel mills during the Korean War, affirming that even in times of crisis, executive authority must have constitutional or congressional backing. In United States v. Nixon, 1974, the court ruled that executive privilege could not shield a president from complying with judicial subpoenas in a criminal investigation, reinforcing the principle that no one is above the law. Meanwhile, the War Powers Resolution 1973, passed over President Nixon's veto, represented Congress's legislative effort to curb unilateral presidential military action, requiring consultation and limiting the time troops can be deployed without approval. Together, these moments underscore the ongoing struggle to balance energetic executive leadership with constitutional limits and checks from the other branches of government. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer, 1952, also known as the Steel Seizure Case background. In 1952, during the Korean War, American steelworkers were preparing to go on strike over wage disputes. President Harry S. Truman feared that a work stoppage in the steel industry would disrupt production of weapons and other supplies essential for the war effort. Instead of going through Congress, Truman issued an executive order directing Secretary of Commerce Charles Sawyer to seize and operate most of the nation's steel mills to keep them running. The steel companies, led by Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co., challenged this action in court. The constitutional question, the key question before the Supreme Court was, does the president have constitutional authority to seize and operate private industry without explicit congressional authorization? This brought into focus the limits of presidential power under Article 2 of the Constitution. Supreme Court decision, ruling 6-3 against President Truman. The court held that the president did not have the authority to seize private property without legislative approval from Congress. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, emphasized that the president's power must stem either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. Significance. 1. Limits presidential power in domestic affairs. The court made clear that the president cannot act unilaterally to take over private businesses unless Congress has given explicit authority. 2. Affirms separation of powers. By striking down Truman's action, the court reinforced that lawmaking and major policy decisions in domestic matters belong primarily to Congress, not the president. 3. Justice Robert Jackson's concurrence, the famous framework. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion became especially influential in later presidential power cases. He described three categories of presidential authority. O. Maximum authority, when the president acts with explicit or implied approval from Congress. O. Zone of twilight, when Congress is silent and the president acts on independent authority. O. Lowest ebb, when the president acts against the express or implied will of Congress, where presidential power is weakest. Truman's steel seizure, Jackson argued, fell into the lowest ebb category. Why it matters today. Youngstown is still cited in major cases involving executive power, especially when presidents use emergency authority or issue sweeping executive orders. It's a cornerstone precedent showing that even in wartime, presidential power is not unlimited. United States v. Nixon, 1974, key issue, executive privilege and whether it shields the president from complying with a judicial subpoena. Background. In the early 1970s, the Watergate scandal erupted when members of President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Investigations revealed that conversations related to the cover-up might be found on secret White House tape recordings. A special prosecutor subpoenaed these tapes as evidence for the ongoing criminal trial of Nixon's aides. Nixon refused to turn them over, claiming executive privilege, the idea that the president can keep certain communications confidential to protect national security, and the candor of presidential discussions. The constitutional question. The Supreme Court faced the question, does executive privilege give the president absolute immunity from judicial subpoenas in criminal investigations? Supreme Court decision. Ruling 8-0 against President Nixon. Justice Rehnquist recused himself. The court held that executive privilege is not absolute. While it exists to protect sensitive national security or diplomatic communications, it cannot be used to obstruct justice or shield evidence in a criminal investigation. Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote, "Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications, without more, can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process." Key points 1. Executive privilege recognized, but limited. The court acknowledged that executive privilege is important for candid presidential advice and decision-making, but it is qualified, not unlimited. 2. Rule of law applies to all. Even the president must comply with judicial orders in the pursuit of justice. The ruling affirmed the principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. 3. Separation of powers strengthened. The decision reinforced the judiciary's role in checking executive power, especially in criminal proceedings. Impact. Nixon was forced to release the tapes, which revealed evidence implicating him in the Watergate cover-up. Shortly after the tapes became public, Nixon resigned, the only U.S. president to do so. The case remains a landmark precedent on the limits of executive privilege. War Powers Resolution 1973. Key idea: Congress's attempt to limit the president's ability to commit U.S. forces to armed conflict without its approval. Background: the Vietnam War had expanded significantly without a formal declaration of war by Congress. Presidents Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon used the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 1964 and their constitutional role as commander-in-chief to justify large-scale military operations. Many members of Congress believed the presidency had grown too powerful in foreign affairs and that war-making authority had shifted away from its constitutional home in the legislative branch. In response, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973 over President Nixon's veto to reassert its constitutional role in deciding when the nation goes to war. Main provisions. 1. Consultation requirement: the president must consult with Congress in every possible instance before sending U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where imminent involvement is likely. 2. 48-hour reporting rule. If the president sends troops into combat, he must notify Congress within 48 hours of the action, explaining the circumstances, authority, and estimated scope. 3. 60-day limit. Without congressional authorization, a declaration of war, or specific statutory approval, the president must withdraw forces within 60 days. A 30-day extension is allowed for safe withdrawal. 4. Congressional termination power. Congress can direct the removal of troops at any time by passing a concurrent resolution. Constitutional debate. Supporters argue, it enforces the separation of powers by restoring Congress's constitutional role in declaring war. It prevents presidents from dragging the nation into prolonged, undeclared wars. Presidents argue, it infringes on the president's constitutional powers as commander-in-chief. It is unconstitutional because it limits executive flexibility in responding to emergencies. Every president since Nixon has claimed that the War Powers Resolution is invalid, although most have generally followed its reporting requirements. Impact. The War Powers Resolution has never been fully enforced. Congress has rarely used it to force troop withdrawals. Still, it stands as a symbolic assertion of legislative authority over war-making and is frequently cited in debates over U.S. military interventions. If you'd like, I can now combine Youngstown, United States vs. Nixon, and the War Powers Resolution into a single comparative table showing how each limits presidential power in different ways. Do you want me to do that next? You said, write intro paragraph to those 3 cases. ChatGPT said, here's an introductory paragraph that ties together Youngstown Sheet and Tube Cohen v. Sawyer, 1952, United States vs. Nixon, 1974, and the War Powers Resolution, 1973. Taken together, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Cohen v. Sawyer, United States vs. Nixon, and the War Powers Resolution reveal a consistent theme in the American constitutional system. Presidential power is substantial, but it is not without limits. Each instance demonstrates how the judiciary and the legislature act as critical counterweights, ensuring that executive authority remains accountable to the rule of law and the framework of the Constitution. Whether in the context of domestic policy during wartime, the protection of justice in a criminal investigation, or the decision to commit troops abroad, these cases and legislative actions affirm that no branch of government operates in isolation. They reflect the framers' vision of a system in which power is checked and balanced to preserve liberty, maintain stability, and guard against the concentration of unchecked authority in any single branch.